in the city of Fremont, California. You are more or less standing on the Hayward Fault, right? I wouldn't bring you here if we weren't nearby. The Hayward Fault is a right lateral, mostly a right lateral strike slip fault system. As you know, that means that if it just so happened to be right here, and this gentleman and I were having a conversation, and an earthquake happened of sufficient magnitude, we'd end up like this, right? And that would happen more or less within a second or two. Well, in addition to the strike slip component, this fault has a dip slip component, an up-down component. And it's for that reason that this park, which is more or less flat, is at a significantly higher elevation than that neighborhood, which is also more or less flat. And we use this to demonstrate releasing and restraining geometries on strike slip faults that have stepovers or bends. And it turns out that stepovers and bends help explain a lot about the topography of the Bay Area. The idea is that the fault has three domains or segments. It has the northern and southern parts are parallel to one another, and then the central part is at an angle. So my instructions to students are now make right lateral offset happen while keeping the fault walls adjacent to one another on the northern and southern parts, and let happen what may on the central part. Okay, with a sheet of paper you get overlap, but with rocks you would have uplift, right? You'd have thickening of the lithosphere. The average creep rate is about 9 millimeters a year. The surface creep rate here is about 5 millimeters a year. But that's only down about 2 or 3 kilometers, and it's locked below there, so almost all of the strain is still accumulating. There's very little release, unfortunately, of the built-up strain. But they know when the curb was constructed from city records, so they can just come out here 20 years later, measure the offset, and come up with an average creep rate. The overall slip rate, the average geologic slip rate over thousands of years is 9 millimeters per year. But what's important here is that the big amount of surface creep is not relieving the seismic hazard, because the creep isn't happening all the way down. The seismogenic zone goes to 15 or 20 kilometers, but the creep is only in the upper 3. So most of the strain is still accumulating. What I have my students do on this trip, which usually takes about 3.5 hours, is we make a map of the Hayward Fault with this as our base map. Because what matters is the orientation of the line that you draw. We're going to compare the orientation of the fault segment that we map here with the orientation at the next stop. You probably can guess they're not going to be exactly parallel. So one way to do this would be to make a set of dots where you're sure the fault is, and the map is sufficiently of a scale that's going to allow you to figure out exactly where we are. There's the scarp back there, right? Here's the fault right here. The fault on the other side of Grimmer was just west of that tree. So the fault is cutting across Grimmer obliquely. It doesn't cut across at a right angle. We have very detailed maps of all this stuff, and this is the way they did it. We're not doing anything, they didn't do anything special. We're doing the same kinds of studies. There are very few places where the Hayward Fault is found in its natural state. It's been developed across almost everywhere. Here it's just with roads and occasional houses. Elsewhere there are hospitals and office buildings and public schools and university. So it's covered in most places. It's very rare that you can actually see the Hayward Fault. Beyond the fence, you'll see that there is a scarp up there, and that has not been reworked in any appreciable way by humans. So that's the natural escarpment produced by the dip-slip component of the Hayward Fault. The thing is, the Hayward's really narrow here. I mean, well, you saw it over there. Yeah. I mean, and look at it right here. This is a spectacular sight. Sooner or later, these are all tension cracks. I mean, you can come out here, I took my structure class out here. You can do sigma 1 and 3 from this. I mean, those are tension triangles, sigma 3 like that. This is super. It's really outstanding. Yeah, and it's higher on the east side. Just slightly. I mean, if you walk up, you'll sense that it's actually a little higher on the east side. Anyway, welcome to the Hayward Fault. This is one of the most spectacular expressions of it. There are a set of what are called an echelon fractures in the asphalt, in the pavement. And you can see that overall they make a very narrow zone that trends more or less north-northwest right through Gardenia. If we look back to where we were before, it's a straight line. All the features we've seen so far make a straight line on your map. Where do we predict this fault will go now farther to the northwest? Well, there's unfortunately a house in the way. And unfortunately, the fault didn't avoid the house. The house was built, of course, after the fault was there. The fault doesn't go through the corner house, but it does go through the second house. Everybody see the building I'm referring to? Okay, where is it? No, it's no longer here. It used to sit on that hill, this low hill, higher than the flat area over here, higher than the flat area over there, where the person is walking. It's maybe 5 meters, 7 meters elevation or relief. And that building was the Fremont City Hall. So it was the main administration building of this city of 200,000 people. It was constructed in the 60s when Fremont underwent this real boom of population. But starting about 15 years ago, maybe 20, they started to have structural problems with the building because that hill is a pressure ridge, a restraining geometry. There's a strand of the Hayward Fault on both sides. So there was this knoll, a small hill, but it afforded a commanding view of all of Fremont. And so that's where they built City Hall. And starting about 15 years ago, the residents of City Hall were gradually removed and various other buildings in Fremont were used for city functions. There's now a new City Hall a few blocks away off of the fault. For many years, this is a great story, the only use of this building was for the monthly meetings of the city's emergency services group, who were basically going to the Hayward Fault. I chose the Hayward Fault for this field trip because it's, by consensus among people who study the faults of the Bay Area, the one most likely to produce the next damaging earthquake here. The last earthquake was in 1868. Any day now, and it could be 10 years or 30 years from now, the Hayward Fault will produce another magnitude 6.5 or 7, maybe even larger. And it'll be a catastrophic earthquake because humans have developed across almost its entire extent. Here, the Hayward Fault's been covered by roads, schools, hospitals, a university, houses, and a number of other sorts of human developments. First of all, there are many suburban neighborhoods. There are also old towns. For instance, downtown Hayward. If you're a Haywardite, it's between A and D streets, especially between Mission and Main. And you can't miss the Hayward Fault. It goes right through these old brick buildings. Many of them have had to be retrofitted. A couple have been abandoned. You can see lots of examples of fault features on the parking lots and the roads that have been constructed across the Hayward Fault. These are easily fixable, and they're also not nearly as valuable as some other major construction. For instance, Fairmont Hospital lies partially astride the Hayward Fault. At least one PG&E substation. You know what these look like. That's where all the towers are behind the fences, and they help relay the power in the power grid that serves the Bay Area. built on the Hayward Fault. UC Berkeley has the fault goes through UC Berkeley campus, and several buildings lie on top of the fault. Most famously is Cal Stadium, which is being pulled apart by creep and is easily visible to see at the concrete the concrete wall that surrounds the stadium. It's ongoing creep, and we're going to see evidence of that shortly. So there's always creep, very slow, imperceptible motion, and it produces effects on the curbs and the streets of this area. But the last major earthquake was a magnitude 7 in 1868. And it's hard to know exactly how large it was, of course, because that's before any seismometers were around. Yeah, there have been more earthquakes in this region since then, but the last one on the Hayward was in 1868. Several dozen trenches have been dug across the Hayward Fault over the past 30 or 40 years. The Hayward Fault extends from down in southern Fremont, maybe Milpitas, all the way north of Berkeley, goes offshore into San Pablo Bay at Point Pinole, and trenches have been dug in many places along that stretch. You can imagine your typical homeowner isn't too thrilled about having somebody come in and dig a trench in their front yard or backyard. First of all, it's unsightly. Secondly, Junior might fall into it. And third, it potentially is an advertisement that there's a Hayward Fault present, and it doesn't really raise property values. So trenches typically are dug on public property, parks, right-of-ways for the water district, or for railroads, or for railroad tracks, or for universities and schools. Why are these houses built right next to this fault? The legislation in the state that protects potential homeowners is very new. The first law that was ever passed was passed in 1971 and didn't really take effect until 72 or 3. Many of these houses are actually about that age or even a little older. And then disclosure laws that are supposed to go into effect when you sell a property weren't passed until 1993. So unfortunately, a lot of these people purchased their properties without knowing that the Hayward Fault was right here. If we were to keep walking in a straight line, we'd run across the Tule Pond again. In fact, in the distance beyond that, you should be able to see a row of recently constructed apartments. The front of the apartments is almost exactly parallel to the Hayward Fault. And that's because there's a setback required by law of 50 feet from the trace of the Hayward Fault. So the Hayward Fault goes out that way, and the buildings are right there. I mean, they're right up against it. In fact, the building project had to be slightly modified because a geologist came out and dug a trench and found a trace of the fault that had never been mapped before. And the building project was already partly underway, and they had to stop, tear some stuff down, and redesign the project. See the pink buildings on the other side? That's the other side of the fault zone. See those? Same deal. So all this legislation is doing is protecting buildings from being torn apart by creep or surface rupture. It's not saying anything about liquefaction or ground shaking after an earthquake. The other legislation is we hope forthcoming sometime to try and protect property owners from the hazards, especially of liquefaction and landsliding. To do that, you need real detailed maps, and those are now really becoming nearly complete. As we walked along the fault, you could see the fault doesn't go through the garage door. The fault goes through the back of the house, kind of. But in the United States, at least, the house is built on a concrete foundation, and if the foundation is affected by creep, what's going to happen to the entire building? The entire building is going to be rotated, right? Even if the fault just goes through a little part of the foundation, the whole building is going to be subject to some kind of torque or rotation, and that's reflected in the structural frame that you can see, and he'll never be able to sell it probably. He can't insure it. He's had to replace his driveway 4 times. And you can see what he finally decided to do was not use concrete, but instead to use bricks. And now it's fixed. You don't have to replace, spend a lot of money to repair it. But I want you to look at the wall on the right-hand side of the building. The second story and the first story, they're like this. They're no longer vertical, they're arched, like so. Yeah? Also, the support column, the support columns on this side of the building are no longer vertical either. These tracks are supposed to be continued down to San Jose, where we work. And we could just take Bart to do this field trip. But look at the map and think about the construction of those tracks. First of all, right here, it's basically on the Hayward Fault. So any kind of construction that's going to carry it to the south is going to have to be very careful about its location with respect to its placement with respect to the fault. Also, in a built-up area like this, getting access, getting permission is always a problem. And so what plans, at least as far as I know, still call for is to actually run the tracks through Lake Elizabeth Park, because that's public land and it won't be nearly as expensive to obtain the right-of-way. But what does that mean?
Right along the Hayward.
Not just right along it, it has to cross it. Because the fault is currently east of the BART tracks. But if they're going to put the BART tracks in Lake Elizabeth Park, they're going to have to cross under or over or whatever, and then they're going to have to cross again to get into San Jose.